Going to talk about sea level rise for a few moments. So it's already occurring. It's not something that we're going to see happen in the future. It is already here. For the last 100 years, we've seen about 10 inches of sea level rise in Puget Sound already. So we already see sites like this for Quartermaster Drive on Vashon, or this house on Docton Head. West Seattle back in 2012, we had a really big winter storm, one of the highest tides on record. Docton Park, if you can see the pointer, that's normally dry. Most of this parking lot is underwater. The dock normally points down, not up. Alki Beach, the Statue of Liberty is normally dry. So one of the things when we look ahead to sea level rise into the future, there's been a couple of different reports done recently, and they looked at the probability of different amounts of sea level rise occurring. And right now, there's almost 100% certainty we will see it at a minimum 1 more foot over the next 100 years. There's about 83% certainty that we're more likely to see 2 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And right now, there are about 20% certainty around potentially seeing 3 feet of sea level rise. And all I can say is these numbers keep changing every few years as they update the different data behind these. And generally, the certainty numbers keep going up every time a new one of these reports comes out, as we learn more and understand more. And one of the main reasons why we see this is that for the last 25 years or so, we've had a lot of warm weather. We've had 19 of the 20 warmest years on record in the last 23-ish years. That's a lot of warm weather. And you say, well, why does that matter? Well, predominantly, it's 2 things that are driving sea level rise, both tied back to warming. One, water that's warm just takes up more space physically. It just is not as dense. And then on top of that, we're getting more water running off the land because the glaciers are melting. So those 2 factors alone drive the majority of the sea level rise that we have been seeing for the last 100 years and what we expect to see in the future. So there was a study done out of Olympia area that looked at and said, like, in essence, a 1 foot sea level rise change would turn the 100-year sort of flood storm event into something that looks more like occurring every 2 years. So this is roughly a 100-year storm event here in this image in West Seattle, but that would be something you would experience now every 2 years. A study done up in the San Juans basically predicted that bluff erosion rates would double by the end of the century due to the increase in sea level rise. And so you'll see a lot more things like these bluffs kind of eroding, really expensive engineering solutions to try and stabilize the slope, a lot more challenging access down to the beach because stairs and other sort of towers are less stable. Another component of sea level rise is something we call the coastal squeeze. And so when a beach is unarmored, the beach, as John was describing how a beach face was formed with the wave coming in, that can actually shift and change with sea level rise. And so if you had no armor, shoreline armor in the way, the beach would just shift up and migrate inland a little bit, along with all the habitats that are in the beach that I'll talk about later. When we have coastal armoring, bulkheads, seawalls, and the like, the beach is not able to adjust inland, and all those habitats basically get squeezed out of existence. And so we lose spawning habitat for forage fish and places for juvenile salmon to rear. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit to nearshore ecology. Please put questions in the chat. At the end of this particular section, John and I'll answer questions that are in the chat, and then we'll take a break. So when we talk about nearshore, we're talking about basically the upland forested area or the riparian forest all the way down to sort of the limits of kelp growth. So kelp needs sun to grow. And so the photic zone, this is the area, sort of the Band-Aid that sort of brings the uplands and the deep ocean together. Is this little strip that we call the nearshore. Has lots of really dynamic things going on, all the erosion and from bluffs that John mentioned, beaches changing, we've got eelgrass, we've got trees, kelp, lots of different fish going along in there. In Puget Sound, we have somewhere on the order of 3,000 miles of beaches. We have about 10,000 different streams and rivers that flow into Puget Sound. And this is where we sort of live, is this drainage alone. But sometimes you may have heard the term Salish Sea. So Salish Sea refers to the broader area of Puget Sound, beyond Puget Sound and Puget Sound itself. So if you look at Puget Sound, it basically is a little less than half of the larger Salish Sea. So all of this area interacts and sort of drains into and out through the Strait of Juan de Fuca for the most part. So Puget Sound is what we would call an estuary. It's a semi-enclosed body of water that has salinity levels that are less than the open ocean. In our case, portions of Puget Sound are close to the salinity of the open ocean, but still a little bit below. So we have our estuary we have really steep shoreline with what we would call a narrow shore zone or nearshore zone. As John mentioned, like on the East Coast, you see a lot of sand. We have sand and gravel beaches. We're a bit unusual across the United States in having this sort of structure of our beaches. We also have very strong regional gradients within Puget Sound. We have much fresher water actually to the north and saltier water to the south because of things like the Fraser and the Skagit River dumping really large amounts of fresh water up above compared to the southern half. We also see 2 tides a day, and we get some very strong differences in tides, whereas the tidal range is much stronger the further south into Puget Sound you go. So you'll see a much bigger gap between high and low tide. And we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day, whereas parts of the United States only see 1 high tide and low tide in a day. In our case, because of this change in tides and because of salinity, we have the ecology, so the things that are living on the beach or rely on the beach, is strongly linked to those physical and geological processes, which is why we have John go first. So if you can think about like what sort of different types of invertebrates might fit in, say, the sand compared to large cobble, very different things live there. And if you also think about high on the beach where it gets dried out very often versus further down on the closer to the low tide line where something can get exposed to the air for just a few hours a day versus 7 or 8 hours a day, different things can thrive in those different locations. So it really ties back to these physical processes. And that strip of land or strip of nearshore is really dynamic and where a lot of the biological, sort of rich biological diversity occurs in Puget Sound. The further out you go into the deeper water, the less number of species you see, and it's a little more simplistic. This is a comparison of Puget Sound to Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary. Puget Sound is the second largest. And you'll see that these two are using the same color scheme to denote depth. And you can tell that the Chesapeake is much shallower than Puget Sound. And it's because of the glaciers carved much of Puget Sound in comparison to the Chesapeake. And what you'll also notice, like, because it is so shallow, the sun can reach most of the water and most of the floor of the estuary. Whereas most of Puget Sound, the depth means sunlight can't reach down that far. And so there's no photosynth occurring down there and other sort of activity. So it's a very different system because of how deep it is compared to something like the Chesapeake. Now within Puget Sound, we do have a lot of different species of wildlife that you find along the shoreline. We have well over 200 species of fish that use the shoreline. We do not have truly a lot of marine mammals that we see on a regular basis here. But we do have hundreds of aquatic invertebrates, probably more than we know because they haven't been well studied overall. So there's quite a bit of diversity of different types of animals we see. Just a few of the more flashier fish species. So we have things like grunt sculpins, which are only a few inches long. Sand dabs are a type of flounder or a flatfish. So they have the ability to camouflage and change their coloration to match their background. And they have both eyes on one side of their head if you haven't seen them before. We have things that are really tiny, this golf ball sized spiny lumpsucker. That is just a great name, but they hang out in the eelgrass in some of the surf. We have gunnels, which can match the sea lettuce or ulva that frequently found along the shoreline, and they're like an eel, but they're not eels. And then we have things like the ratfish, which are related to sharks, really old species. They have some bioluminescence. They're really gorgeous fish. They just slowly glide through the water, and unfortunately, they have two big rat-type teeth at the front, which is how they got their name. Because it's not a very pleasant name to call them ratfish, given how pretty they are. We also have a lot of different wildlife, as I mentioned. So we have osprey that love to eat pink salmon. We have definitely a whole bunch of river otters that hang out along the shoreline. We generally don't see sea otters in Puget Sound. There's occasionally one or two that show up. And then we actually have some things like this rough-skinned newt in the lower left and fence lizards, things I never would have anticipated when I was growing up, where I grew up. Seeing reptiles in the shoreline, which is not something I remember. But we have on the West Coast, we do have a bunch of those species that rely on that large wood to hide and then pop back out when it gets warmer. I'm going to talk about this group of fish here called forage fish. They're in the middle here. Now, these fish are extremely important because they are the ones that take phytoplankton. They eat phytoplankton. So phytoplankton uses sunlight to grow, and the forage fish eat those tiny little guys. And then they make all that energy available to the things that we as humans tend to care about. So salmon, seabirds, sea lions, and then of course through orcas and larger whales like humpbacks and gray whales. Now, what's really important about how forage fish behave is that they generally use the shoreline to spawn. So surf smelt will spawn way up, all the way up to the drift log line, sand lance a little further down, and then herring need the subtidal to intertidal area with eelgrass and algae, because they spawn on the algae, whereas the other two spawn actually in the sand and gravel itself. And so this is a shot of a surf smelt and about the size of what you would typically expect for an adult. Now, when you think about what size material these guys are looking for to spawn in, for surf smelt, you're looking at something between a Bic pen and a toothpick. So not really big stuff overall. With sand lance, it's really between a toothpick and a sheet of paper, which is partly how they get their name of being sort of affinity with sand. So these guys are looking for a relatively smaller sized material versus really coarse beaches. And this is an example of how when surf smelt are spawning, they generally spawn in large amounts. And across King County area, about 30 to 40% of the beaches have been documented with forage fish spawning. We expect the number historically was much larger before humans modified the beaches the way we have. So we have two species of eelgrass in our area. The eelgrass in the upper left hand side of the photo is a non-native species that was brought over with the oyster industry called Zostera japonica. And then the one on the right-hand side of that left photo and then the right-hand photo is the native eelgrass. And so this is where the two eelgrasses, the native one, they're also really important to our economy today. So people flock to the Pike Place Market to see salmon being thrown around. People still love to go out and go fishing for salmon, partly because they really like to eat them for dinner, but also the orca that reside in Puget Sound for much of the year, also like to eat salmon. So the orcas that we have in Puget Sound rely on salmon for the majority of their diet, and Chinook salmon specifically for about 3/4 of their diet. So they are really keyed in on eating salmon. And unfortunately, our salmon populations, especially Chinook populations, are somewhere around 5 to 7% in abundance compared to where they were 100, 150 years ago. So Chinook numbers are really depressed compared to where they were, which impacts the orcas if they don't have enough food. So in our area, we do have more than Chinook. So we do have pink salmon that come in generally in the odd years, like this year. There'll be a decent run in Puget Sound. Coho or silver salmon. We have sockeye salmon in the Lake Washington system. Chum salmon or dog salmon pop up in most of the coastal streams. And then we have a variety of trout species as well. So steelhead and cutthroat are both trout species. Steelhead and Chinook are both listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act. And so their numbers are highly depressed compared to where they were historically. And there's lots of effort around trying to restore their habitat. For those of you not familiar with how salmon behave, they spend part of their life out in the ocean, a large portion of their life actually. They come back to a river, they find someone to spawn with, they make a nest or a redd in really large-sized gravel. The juveniles will pop up out of the gravel a few months later. Depending on the species, they'll spend anywhere from a couple hours, couple days in the freshwater before migrating down to the mouth of the river, or they may spend up to a year and a half in the river rearing, depending on the species. And then they would go out into Puget Sound, and when they're about 3 inches in size, and they would forage along the shoreline, so it's really important to have food. They go out to the ocean. When the adults come back, when they hit freshwater, they generally don't eat. And so they're looking to fatten up as much as they can for the last few months of their life where they don't eat. And that's where forage fish really becomes super important, because the adults come back and they'll gorge on them before they enter the river system. We did a study a few years ago where we looked at where fish are coming from, the juvenile fish that are in Puget Sound. And we found in the King County area that we had 22 different hatcheries or from 13 different watersheds showing up in the King County area. So Puget Sound is that sort of classic context of like a melting pot where all the fish come in, they intermingle, they're all swirling around Puget Sound. So skagit fish come down here, Nisqually fish come up through, our fish go down to Nisqually. They're all intermingling. We also wanted to figure out, since they were just listed at the time when we did this study, what are they eating and what habitats are most important? And we basically drugged the fish and then we pumped their stomach, put them back, released them alive but very hungry. And then what we found out was we kind of expected there would be a lot of the polychaete worms like in the bottom where they're feeding off of stuff on the bottom, or crab larvae floating in the water column. We did not anticipate that they would still be eating invertebrates from the land, like the leafhoppers, and a lot of them actually. And this points to the importance of shoreline vegetation, where insects will hang out, they fall into the water and become food source. So this was a really important finding. It really points to how important shoreline vegetation is. And when we look at the whole sort of beach environment, it's all connected through whether you care about oysters or orca, all of it ties back to the health of beaches and whether or not there's places for forage fish to spawn and sort of Chinook to eat forage fish and or great blue heron to eat forage fish, etc. So all of this area is fully connected.